Imagine a world where a single individual could control the flow of information to the most powerful leader, dictating policy and shaping the very fabric of society, all while remaining unseen and unaccountable. Now, picture that individual weaponizing their influence for personal gain, manipulating the system to amass wealth and power beyond measure. This isn't a dystopian fantasy, it's the true story of Hugh Despenser the Younger, a medieval courtier whose unchecked ambition led to both spectacular rise and a grotesque, unforgettable downfall. The year is 1316. Forget the grand battles and valiant knights of traditional history. The real power plays were happening in the hushed corridors of Edward II's court, where whispers held more weight than swords. Hugh Despenser the Younger, a name that wouldn't command a second glance in the annals of military prowess, found himself unexpectedly thrust into the role of royal chamberlain. This seemingly innocuous position was the key to unlocking unimaginable influence. Think of it as having access to the president's private server, deciding which emails get read, which calls get answered, and which voices are completely silenced. That was Hugh's reality in medieval England, a world of parchment scrolls and wax seals where information was currency and access was absolute power. This wasn't about managing schedules or coordinating events, it was about controlling the very narrative that shaped the kingdom. Imagine your boss's assistant wielding the authority to make or break your career based on a personal whim. Now, amplify that by 1,000, add a crown, and you're starting to grasp the scale of Hugh's control. Edward II, the King of England, was known for his, let's call it, disinterest in the nitty-gritty details of governance. He preferred rural pursuits and personal relationships to the weighty responsibilities of ruling a kingdom. This created a vacuum, a void that Hugh Despenser eagerly filled. He positioned himself as indispensable, the man who could navigate the complexities of court, manage the endless stream of petitions and demands, and shield the king from the unpleasant realities of governing. He wasn't merely an advisor, he was a puppeteer, pulling the strings of the English government while the king remained blissfully unaware of his manipulation. The story of Hugh's appointment is a masterclass in medieval power dynamics. He wasn't chosen for his military skill or diplomatic acumen. He was chosen because he knew how to speak the right words at the right time to the right person. He possessed a talent for flattery, an understanding of Edward's insecurities, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the king's desires. Within weeks of becoming Chamberlain, Hugh restructured the entire royal household, ensuring that all communication, all requests, all decisions flowed through him. He created a bottleneck, a single point of failure for the entire kingdom. If you wanted the king's ear, you had to go through Hugh, and Hugh decided who was worthy and who was not. Picture a typical day in Edward II's court after Hugh's ascent. Before dawn, Hugh arrives at the king's chambers, greeted by a mountain of letters from nobles, bishops, and foreign ambassadors. But here's where the game begins. Hugh doesn't simply sort the mail, he decides which letters the king will never see, consigning them to the flames with a flick of his wrist. That scathing complaint from the Earl of Lancaster about exorbitant taxes? Into the fire. The urgent message from the Bishop of Winchester detailing widespread church corruption? Hugh will handle that personally, thank you very much. He becomes the ultimate gatekeeper, controlling the flow of information and shielding the king from anything that might challenge his authority or disrupt his idyllic world. Imagine your boss's assistant wielding the authority to make or break your career based on a personal whim. Now amplify that by 1,000, add a crown, and you're starting to grasp the scale of Hugh's control. Edward II, the King of England, was known for his, let's call it, disinterest in the nitty-gritty details of governance. He preferred rural pursuits and personal relationships to the weighty responsibilities of ruling a kingdom. This created a vacuum, a void that Hugh Despenser eagerly filled. He positioned himself as indispensable, the man who could navigate the complexities of court, manage the endless stream of petitions and demands, and shield the king from the unpleasant realities of governing. He wasn't merely an advisor, he was a puppeteer, pulling the strings of the English government while the king remained blissfully unaware of his manipulation. The story of Hugh's appointment is a masterclass in medieval power dynamics. He wasn't chosen for his military skill or diplomatic acumen. He was chosen because he knew how to speak the right words at the right time to the right person. He possessed a talent for flattery, an understanding of Edward's insecurities, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the king's desires. Within weeks of becoming Chamberlain, Hugh restructured the entire royal household, ensuring that all communication, all requests, all decisions flowed through him. He created a bottleneck, a single point of failure for the entire kingdom. If you wanted the king's ear, you had to go through Hugh, and Hugh decided who was worthy and who was not. Picture a typical day in Edward II's court after Hugh's ascent. Before dawn, Hugh arrives at the king's chambers, greeted by a mountain of letters from nobles, bishops, and foreign ambassadors. But here's where the game begins. Hugh doesn't simply sort the mail, he decides which letters the king will never see, consigning them to the flames with a flick of his wrist. That scathing complaint from the Earl of Lancaster about exorbitant taxes, into the fire. The urgent message from the Bishop of Winchester detailing widespread church corruption, Hugh will handle that personally, thank you very much. He becomes the ultimate gatekeeper, controlling the flow of information and shielding the king from anything that might challenge his authority or disrupt his idyllic world. By afternoon, a line of nobles stretches down the hall, each desperate for an audience with the king. Some have traveled for weeks, spending fortunes to reach court, only to find themselves at the mercy of Hugh's whims. Lord Berkeley, one of England's most powerful barons, once waited 6 months for a meeting that lasted a mere 5 minutes. Why? Because Hugh didn't appreciate the way Berkeley looked at him during a previous encounter. This wasn't an exaggeration. Medieval chronicles meticulously document Hugh's vengeful memory and his tendency to hold grudges. He wielded his power with a petty vindictiveness that bordered on paranoia, punishing perceived slights with ruthless efficiency. Evening arrives, and the king's council convenes. Traditionally, this body included the greatest nobles and churchmen in England, offering diverse perspectives and challenging the king's decisions. But by 1320, Hugh had systematically engineered the removal of anyone who dared to question his authority. He replaced them with sycophants and yes-men, creating an echo chamber where his own opinions were amplified and dissenting voices were silenced. The contemporary chronicler paints a bleak picture, describing the king's council as Dispenser's echo chamber, a gathering of puppets who danced to his tune. The financial control Hugh exerted was staggering. By 1322, Hugh and his father had diverted an estimated 40% of royal revenue into their personal accounts. We're talking about an annual sum equivalent to buying multiple castles or funding a small army. Wealth siphoned directly from the public treasury and funneled into the dispenser's coffers. The Vita Eduardi Secundi, a historical account of Edward II's reign, meticulously records the extent of Hugh's financial manipulation. No grant, no pardon, no appointment occurred without the dispenser's profit. He effectively turned the English government into a personal piggy bank, extracting wealth at every opportunity. Consider the case of William D. Apple, a merchant who sought a trading license for wool exports in 1321. The standard fee was a reasonable 20 marks. Hugh, however, demanded 500 marks plus 10% of all future profits. When William attempted to appeal to the king, Hugh intercepted the complaint and had the unfortunate merchant imprisoned for disturbing the royal peace. William's family was forced to pay a staggering 1,000 marks for his release, a clear example of medieval extortion at its finest. But the most disturbing aspect of Hugh's reign was the apparent complicity of Edward II. The chroniclers report that the king was fully aware of Hugh's actions, yet chose to turn a blind eye, even reveling in his advisor's harsh efficiency. One account states, the king delighted in Dispenser's harsh efficiency, calling him "my dear and faithful Hugh," even as nobles wept at his cruelty. To understand how one man could amass such power, it's crucial to grasp the nuances of medieval court structure. The royal chamberlain was not designed to be a position of influence. It was meant to be an administrative role, a glorified scheduler. But Edward II's personal vulnerabilities and his inability to govern effectively created the perfect opportunity for Hugh to seize control. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. Edward had a previous favorite, Piers Gaveston, who had been murdered by angry barons in 1312. But where Gaveston was flamboyant and antagonistic, Hugh was calculating and systematic. He understood that true power lay not in outward displays of authority, but in the quiet manipulation of the system. The economic incentives for supporting Hugh's regime were compelling. If you played along, you could expect favorable treatment in legal disputes, tax breaks, and lucrative appointments. But if you opposed him, well, medieval England had a remarkably creative array of methods for ruining your life without technically breaking the law. The barons who should have stood against Hugh found themselves caught in a catch-22. Opposing Hugh meant opposing the king, which was treason. But supporting Hugh meant enabling a system that was dismantling the kingdom's traditional power structures. Many chose a third option, waiting, hoping for a shift in the political winds. Modern executive assistants might control calendars, but they can't imprison you for complaining about a meeting time. Contemporary gatekeepers might be irritating, but they can't confiscate your property because they dislike your face. It makes you appreciate transparent government and effective oversight committees, doesn't it? We often complain about political corruption, but at least modern officials are forced to be somewhat subtle about it. Hugh Despenser treated the English treasury like his personal ATM, and the justice system like his private revenge service. And the scariest part is that it was all technically legal because he had the king's unwavering approval. But controlling access was only the first stage of Hugh's master plan. In medieval society, power wasn't just about money or influence. It was about completely breaking your enemies, rendering them incapable of resistance. And Hugh had one enemy he wanted to destroy above all others: Queen Isabella of France, the woman who should have been his greatest political ally. Because once Hugh had secured the king's ear, he set his sights on dismantling the queen's entire life, a decision that would ultimately trigger one of the most spectacular acts of revenge in medieval history. Hugh Despenser's fatal error wasn't merely engaging in political battles with Queen Isabella. He systematically stripped away her dignity, her agency, and everything that defined her as a queen and a mother. This wasn't just about power, it was about inflicting profound personal damage. The year is 1324. Isabella of France has been Queen of England for 16 years. She has skillfully navigated the treacherous currents of court politics, produced heirs to the throne, and maintained the delicate balance of power between England and France. Then, Hugh Despenser decides that she poses a threat that must be neutralized. Not killed, but methodically destroyed, piece by piece. Imagine your spouse's closest confidant suddenly gaining control of your bank accounts, reading your private correspondence, and dictating who you are allowed to speak with. Now, amplify that by the weight of medieval royal power, and you begin to understand the magnitude of Isabella's predicament. This wasn't typical medieval political maneuvering. This was a calculated act of personal warfare, disguised as administrative efficiency. You think divorce is messy in the modern era? Hugh Despenser set a new benchmark for marital discord, transforming England's queen into a prisoner within her own kingdom. Contemporary chronicles describe this process as stripping away her dignity like bark from a tree. But they miss the crucial point. Hugh wasn't just humiliating Isabella, he was inadvertently creating his own executioner, planting the seeds of his own destruction. Let's begin with September 1324, the month that Hugh Despenser effectively ended Isabella's life as queen. The official justification was England's ongoing conflict with France, but the execution was driven by pure malice. In a single day, Hugh orchestrated the seizure of 28 estates belonging to Isabella, properties worth approximately £20,000 annually. To put that in perspective, that's more than the revenue generated by most duchies. But the truly insidious aspect was the method of seizure. Royal clerks arrived at each property simultaneously at dawn, reading identical writs declaring the queen's lands forfeit for the safety of the realm. It was a coordinated attack designed to maximize humiliation and minimize resistance. Isabella's own household accounts document her reaction. "I am treated worse than a merchant's wife, for even they keep their dowries." The land seizure was only the opening salvo. Within a week, Hugh ordered the arrest of Isabella's French servants. 31 individuals were seized in coordinated night raids, dragged from their beds and thrown into dungeons. Her physician, a man who had served her since childhood, was imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges of corresponding with enemies of England. No trial, no evidence presented, just Hugh's word that these individuals pose a threat to the realm. The purge extended to Isabella's confessor, her children's tutors, even her ladies-in-waiting. The Chronicle of London records, "The Queen wept openly in court, but none dared comfort her for fear of Despenser's wrath." One noblewoman who offered Isabella a handkerchief was later fined 100 marks for encouraging sedition. The climate of fear was palpable, stifling any expression of sympathy or support. Hugh then targeted Isabella's children, the future of England's royal line. Prince John, age 8, was removed from his mother's household and placed in the care of Hugh's wife, Eleanor de Clare. Princess Eleanor, only 6, was moved to Despenser properties in Wales. Isabella was granted one supervised visit per month, with Hugh's agents present to monitor all conversations. It was a deliberate attempt to sever the bond between mother and children, isolating Isabella and undermining her influence. The Scottish incident of 1325 reveals the depths of Hugh's campaign. Isabella was traveling to negotiate a peace treaty with Scotland, a legitimate royal duty. But Hugh withdrew her military escort just as she entered contested territory. She narrowly escaped capture by Scottish forces, saved only by local monks who provided shelter. Hugh's alleged comment upon hearing of her close call? "One less problem to manage if the Scots had done their job." This incident highlights the calculated nature of Hugh's actions. He wasn't simply trying to undermine Isabella politically, he was actively endangering her life. Here's the moment that reveals the true extent of Hugh's cruelty. Christmas 1324. Traditionally, a time when the royal family appeared together in a display of unity and goodwill. Hugh arranged for Isabella to be seated not beside the king, but below the salt, the medieval equivalent of being relegated to the kids' table. Foreign ambassadors expressed their shock at seeing England's queen treated like a minor courtier, a deliberate humiliation designed to diminish her status in the eyes of the world. Isabella's correspondence from this period, preserved in French archives, reveals her deteriorating mental state. "I am a prisoner without walls, a queen without authority, a mother without children, a wife without a husband's protection." To fully grasp the horror of Isabella's situation, you need to understand the role and significance of queenship in medieval Europe. A queen's power derived from 3 primary sources: her landed wealth, her household, and her role as mother to royal children. Hugh systematically attacked all 3, effectively stripping Isabella of her queenly identity. The land seizures were not just about finances, they were deeply symbolic. In medieval law, land ownership equated to political voice. By confiscating Isabella's estates, Hugh essentially removed her from the political conversation. She could no longer reward supporters, maintain alliances, or exercise patronage. She became completely dependent on whatever allowance Hugh Despenser deigned to grant her. The removal of her French servants played into existing tensions between England and France. England and France were frequently in conflict, and xenophobia was a useful political tool. But Isabella's servants weren't spies. They were her connection to her homeland, her childhood, her identity as a French princess. Hugh understood that isolating her emotionally would make her more vulnerable and easier to control. The removal of her children was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Medieval queens derived enormous prestige and influence from their maternal role. By controlling access to her children, Hugh controlled Isabella's future influence. Even if Edward II were to die, Hugh calculated that Isabella would lack the power base necessary to challenge him as regent. What made this campaign particularly effective was its veneer of legality. Everything Hugh did was accompanied by royal writs, proper documentation, and official justification. He wasn't breaking laws, he was weaponizing them, twisting the legal system to achieve his malicious ends. French chroniclers described it as tyranny dressed in bureaucracy. Edward II's role in all of this remains a subject of debate among historians. Was he an active participant in Hugh's schemes, or merely a passive enabler? Contemporary accounts suggest that he was so dependent on Hugh that he genuinely believed these measures were necessary for the good of the realm. One chronicler noted, "The king saw through Despenser's eyes and heard through Despenser's ears." Modern custody battles look civilized compared to this medieval destruction of a mother's rights. Today's victims of financial abuse have legal remedies available to them. Isabella had none. Imagine losing your children not because you're unfit, but because your spouse's friend doesn't like your accent. That's essentially what happened to England's queen. We now recognize coercive control as a form of abuse. In medieval England, it was simply politics. Hugh Despenser pioneered techniques that modern psychologists would classify as systematic emotional torture: isolation, financial control, maternal alienation. He wrote the playbook for destroying someone without laying a finger on them. But here's what Hugh failed to understand about backing a French princess into a corner. Isabella wasn't just any noblewoman. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, the king who ruthlessly destroyed the Knights Templar. She possessed iron in her blood and a thirst for revenge in her DNA. Taking her children was the moment Isabella decided that Hugh had to die. Not just die, but be obliterated so completely that England would never forget the consequences of pushing a queen too far. But before Isabella could enact her revenge, Hugh managed to make himself even more enemies. Because apparently destroying the queen wasn't enough, Hugh decided to become a pirate. Yes, you read that correctly. When briefly exiled in 1321, this royal favorite literally became a pirate, attacking English ships in the English Channel. It's a move so audacious, so utterly внезапный, it defies belief. Context is crucial here. In 1321, a coalition of barons, finally pushed to their breaking point, forced Edward II to exile the Despensers. Most exiled nobles sought refuge in France or Italy, patiently waiting for the political storm to subside. Hugh, however, chose a different path. He acquired a ship and began robbing merchants in the English Channel. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was a blatant display of contempt for the entire kingdom, a defiant middle finger to the barons who dared to challenge his authority. Imagine a dismissed White House chief of staff hijacking cargo ships off the coast of Virginia. That's the level of audacity we're talking about here. The Chronicle of Lanercost captures the stunned reaction of the English populace. Despenser, who once judged others for theft, became the greatest thief on the narrow seas. Hugh wasn't just stealing, he was constructing a criminal enterprise that would finance his return to power. This wasn't mere survival, it was a strategic business venture, fueled by vengeance. The numbers are staggering. In just 3 months of exile, Hugh's pirate fleet captured 16 merchant vessels. These weren't humble fishing boats. They were major trading ships, laden with wool, wine, and silver. The total haul was valued at approximately £60,000, an amount that most nobles would never accumulate in a lifetime. But here's where the story takes an even more bizarre turn. Hugh meticulously documented his piracy. Medieval pirates typically didn't bother with paperwork, but Hugh approached his criminal activities with the same meticulous attention to detail that he had once applied to royal affairs. He treated piracy like a legitimate business. The captured documents list specific cargoes: 2,000 sacks of wool from Southampton, 500 tons of Gascon wine, Flemish cloth worth 8,000 marks, and enough Spanish silver to mint coins. The testimonies of captured merchants paint a surreal picture of their encounters with the pirate chamberlain. Robert Dretton, whose ship was seized near Dover, testified, "Lord Despenser appeared on deck, wearing his court clothes beneath a mariner's coat, commanding pirates as if conducting a council meeting." Another merchant reported that Hugh personally inspected cargo manifests with the same scrutiny he had once devoted to royal documents. The Cinque Ports bore the brunt of Hugh's maritime terror. These 5 ports, Dover, Sandwich, Romney, Hythe, and Hastings, formed the naval backbone of England. Hugh didn't just raid ships leaving these ports, he attacked the ports themselves. The raid on Sandwich in November 1321 saw Despenser's men burn warehouses belonging to his political rivals, while carefully avoiding those of potential allies. Here's the detail that reveals Hugh's tactical brilliance. He utilized intelligence gathered during his time in court to target specific ships. He knew shipping schedules, cargo values, and when naval patrols would be at their weakest. This wasn't random piracy, it was a calculated campaign of economic warfare. The incident involving 2 Genoese vessels nearly triggered an international war. Hugh's fleet attacked the ships, which were carrying luxury goods to London. Genoa threatened to ban English merchants from the Mediterranean, and French diplomats sent furious letters to Edward II, complaining about your favorite turned sea criminal who attacks ships under royal protection. But the most astonishing aspect of Hugh's piracy was his ability to recruit a private navy of over 200 men, including dispossessed knights, experienced sailors, and hardened criminals. He established bases on the Channel Islands, created supply chains for stolen goods, and even issued his own form of safe passage documents. He had effectively created a parallel maritime government. The Bishop of Exeter wryly observed, "Despenser rules the waves more effectively as a pirate than he ever ruled the land as chamberlain." Medieval piracy differed significantly from the romanticized portrayals in Hollywood films. It was often state-sanctioned through letters of marque, blurring the lines between pirate and privateer. But Hugh operated without any legal cover. He was a straightforward criminal. The English Channel in 1321 was the Amazon shipping route of medieval Europe. Everything flowed through it: wool to Flanders, wine from Gascony, goods from the Mediterranean. By controlling even a portion of these waters, Hugh could generate immense wealth rapidly. What made Hugh's piracy particularly effective was its insider knowledge. He knew which merchants had outstanding debts to the crown, which ships carried the most valuable cargo, and when naval patrols would be at their weakest. He converted bureaucratic knowledge into piratical advantage. The political dimension is also crucial. Every ship Hugh robbed potentially belonged to someone who had supported his exile. This was targeted economic revenge. The wool merchants who had funded the baronial opposition found their profits vanishing into Hugh's war chest. But why didn't Edward II intervene to stop him? The answer is simple. The king was secretly working to recall Hugh from exile. Every pound Hugh stole was potentially a pound that could finance their return to power. Edward's navy received orders to patrol everywhere except the areas where Hugh was operating. The Channel Islands played a critical role in Hugh's piratical activities. These islands occupied a legal gray area, technically English but practically independent. Hugh exploited this ambiguity, creating what some historians consider the first organized crime syndicate in English waters. Medieval maritime law was surprisingly complex. Ships captured in just war could be legally kept, but defining just war was notoriously flexible. Hugh claimed that he was waging war against rebels and traitors to the crown, which conveniently included anyone who had supported his exile. Modern politicians might use offshore accounts to conceal their wealth, but they don't literally transform into pirates when they're ousted from power. Today's disgraced officials write memoirs or become lobbyists. They don't commandeer fleets and terrorize shipping lanes. It makes you appreciate the existence of the Coast Guard and international maritime law. Hugh Despenser treated the English Channel like his personal toll booth, extracting payments from anyone who wanted to conduct business. It's akin to a dismissed cabinet member robbing trucks on the interstate and calling it alternative governance. The sheer audacity of it all continues to shock historians. A royal advisor commanding pirates while still technically serving the crown? That's corruption evolving into something entirely new. Contemporary white-collar criminals appear almost amateurish compared to Hugh's transformation from bureaucrat to buccaneer. But the piracy was merely preparation for the systematic theft he would perpetrate once he regained power. Hugh learned a valuable lesson during his maritime crime spree. Direct theft was profitable, but legal theft was far more sustainable. Within months, Edward II recalled Hugh from exile, and the pirate admiral once again became royal chamberlain. Now he possessed a war chest, a criminal network, and absolutely no fear of consequences. The kingdom was about to experience theft on a scale that made piracy seem almost quaint. Once Hugh regained power, he no longer needed pirate ships. He had something far more potent: the king's seal and absolutely no conscience. Hugh Despenser's return from exile in 1322 heralded the commencement of the most audacious scheme of property theft in medieval English history. In a mere 4 years, he pilfered more land than the majority of noble families had amassed over centuries. This wasn't achieved through conquest or warfare. It was administrative plunder on an unprecedented scale. Consider modern controversies surrounding eminent domain. Now envision a scenario where one individual could exploit governmental authority to foreclose on half of California. You're then approaching an understanding of the magnitude of Hugh's ambitions. Contemporary chronicles refer to this period as the Great Devouring, depicting Hugh as consuming the kingdom piece by piece. You might complain about property taxes and zoning regulations, but let me regale you with tales of medieval property expropriation, where the sole law was Hugh's avarice and the only recourse was appealing to a king who co-signed every transgression. What transpired between 1322 and 1326 makes contemporary financial crimes seem like mere petty theft. Let's begin with the case of Lady Bardolph, a widow who held 3 prosperous manors in Leicestershire. In 1324, Hugh decided he desired her lands. The legal pretext? She was accused of plotting against the king, a charge so nebulous it could encompass anything from actual treason to simply complaining about taxes. Lady Bardolph was apprehended at dawn, dragged to the Tower of London, and subjected to what the records euphemistically term sharp questioning. While torture was technically illegal for nobles, Hugh possessed a talent for creative interpretations of legality. After 3 weeks of imprisonment in conditions that shattered her mind, Lady Bardolph signed documents transferring her estates to Hugh Despenser. The contemporary account states, "The lady, once proud and strong, emerged from the tower aged beyond her years, her wits scattered like leaves. She died within 6 months of release. Hugh acquired her lands valued at £500 annually. The legal documentation was impeccable, signed, sealed, and witnessed, entirely legitimate, if one disregarded the torture." The Gloucester inheritance theft showcases Hugh operating at peak shamelessness. When the Earl of Gloucester died without male heirs, his estates should have been divided among his sisters, including Eleanor de Clare, Hugh's own wife. However, Hugh decided his wife deserved more than her legal share. He produced documents claiming that the other sisters owed massive debts to the crown. These debts were fictitious, but the documents bore the royal seal. When Elizabeth de Clare, one of the sisters, protested, Hugh had her new husband imprisoned on trumped-up charges. She relinquished properties worth £3,000 annually to secure his release. The Welsh expansion revealed Hugh's ultimate ambition: to establish a personal kingdom. Between 1322 and 1326, he acquired 41 castles and lordships in Wales and the Welsh Marches. He didn't conquer these, he stole them through legal manipulation, forged documents, and the strategic imprisonment of owners. The pattern remained consistent: accuse the owner of treason, rebellion, or debt. Seize the property temporarily for the crown. Never return it. Utilize armed men to occupy the estates before legal challenges could be mounted. By 1326, Hugh controlled a contiguous territory stretching from Glamorgan to Pembrokeshire, larger than many continental duchies. The numbers tell a compelling story. Hugh's annual income surged from £500 in 1318 to over £12,000 by 1326. He displaced over 200 minor nobles, destroyed 300 documented families, and controlled more castles than any non-royal in English history. His own words, as recorded by a horrified cleric, "Wales is mine by right of superiority.
for the weak must yield to the strong. To comprehend Hugh's land grab, it's essential to understand how medieval property law functioned, or rather, how it malfunctioned when someone controlled the legal system. Land ownership was documented through charters, but charters could be forged. Legal disputes were adjudicated in royal courts, but Hugh controlled access to those courts. The medieval legal system's vulnerability to royal influence was absolute. Judges served at the king's pleasure. Juries could be intimidated or bribed. Documents could be discovered, proving ancient deaths or treasonous connections. When the individual orchestrating this held the king's complete trust, resistance was almost impossible. Land equaled power in the feudal system. Every estate Hugh stole translated into military resources, economic power, and political influence. He wasn't merely accumulating wealth, he was constructing a power base that rivaled the crown itself. The intimidation factor cannot be overstated. When Lady Bardolph was tortured into relinquishing her lands, every other landholder received the message: resist Hugh and face similar treatment. Many surrendered their properties rather than risk imprisonment and torture. The threat was often sufficient. Why couldn't nobles effectively resist? The baronial opposition that had exiled Hugh in 1321 was shattered after the Battle of Boroughbridge of 1322. The Earl of Lancaster, leader of the opposition, was executed.
Other rebellious barons were either dead, exiled, or intimidated into submission. Hugh had learned from his exile. He systematically neutralized potential opposition before they could organize. The role of forged documents warrants emphasis. Medieval document verification was rudimentary. If a charter possessed the correct seals and witnesses, courts generally accepted it as genuine. Hugh employed a team of skilled forgers who created ancient documents proving his claims to various properties. One historian estimated that 40% of Hugh's property claims rested on completely fabricated documentation. Modern asset forfeiture laws appear quaint compared to Hugh's wholesale expropriation of entire counties. Today's corrupt officials at least feign adherence to legal procedures. Hugh simply seized what he desired and fabricated the paperwork afterward. It makes you appreciate property rights and independent courts. We worry about governmental overreach, but imagine if the president's closest confidant could simply declare your house to be his, torture you into signing it over, and then pronounce it legal. That was a typical Tuesday in Hugh Despenser's England. Modern kleptocrats take notes from Swiss bank accounts. Hugh wrote the original playbook. At least contemporary corruption necessitates sophisticated money laundering and offshore schemes. Hugh's method was refreshingly direct. Want something? Take it. Someone complains? Imprison them. Still complaining? Torture them. Dead people don't file appeals. But stealing from nobles was inherently risky. They possessed armies, alliances, and long memories. Hugh's greatest miscalculation was believing he could steal from an institution even more powerful and vindictive than the nobility, the church. 300 families ruined so that one man could play medieval monopoly. But when Hugh began seizing property from bishops and abbeys, he crossed a boundary that even medieval England wouldn't tolerate. Because the church didn't just possess armies, it possessed something far more formidable: the power to condemn your eternal soul. Now we must address the elephant in the medieval room. Were Hugh and King Edward II actually romantically involved, or was this merely the world's first instance of weaponized homophobia? Let's confront this issue directly. Medieval chroniclers accused Hugh and Edward of sodomy, the medieval term for same-sex relationships. But here's the key point. Medieval England didn't do subtlety when attempting to destroy its enemies. Sexual accusations were the nuclear option of character assassination. Consider modern political sex scandals. Now add medieval prejudices, religious fundamentalism, and the death penalty for homosexuality. This wasn't mere gossip, it was justification for murder. The question isn't simply whether Hugh and Edward were lovers, but why this accusation became so central to Hugh's downfall. You must understand that medieval England weaponized sexuality in much the same way that contemporary politics weaponizes social media. Truth was less important than impact.
Regardless of whether Hugh and Edward shared a bed or merely shared power, their enemies ensured that everyone imagined the former. This wasn't about outing anyone, it was about generating disgust so profound that it justified extreme violence. The evidence begins with precedent. Edward II had a previous favorite, Piers Gaveston, who was murdered by barons in 1312. The accusations against Gaveston and Edward were virtually identical: excessive affection, private meetings, sharing beds, exchanging clothes. The Vita Edwardi Secundi states, "The king loved Gaveston beyond measure, as Jonathan loved David." When Hugh ascended to a similar position of prominence, the same accusations resurfaced. But let's examine what contemporaries actually observed versus what they inferred. The Chronicle of Lanercost notes, "The king and Hugh were inseparable, conducting business in private chambers, emerging only for meals." Suspicious, perhaps? Proof of a sexual relationship? Hardly. The lavish gift-giving does raise some eyebrows. Edward bestowed upon Hugh over 50 properties, countless jewels, and positions of power. However, medieval kingship operated on the principle of gift exchange. Edward bestowed similar gifts upon other favorites who were not accused of being his lovers. The difference lay in the sheer volume of gifts Hugh accumulated, a result of his longer tenure. The most explicit accusation comes from Bishop Adam Orleton in 1334, 8 years after Hugh's death. "The king abandoned his wife's bed for the company of Hugh Despenser, indulging in sodomy condemned by God." But note the timing. Orleton leveled this accusation only when it was politically safe to do so, not while Hugh was alive to challenge it. The joint signatures on documents were unprecedented. Kings typically signed documents alone. Edward and Hugh co-signed over 200 documents. Contemporary clerks found this unsettling, as if they were one person in two bodies. But was this indicative of sexual intimacy or political codependence? The counter-evidence is also significant. Hugh was married to Eleanor the Clare and had multiple children. He displayed no recorded interest in men other than Edward. His wife never complained of neglect or abandonment. In fact, she actively participated in his schemes. If Hugh was gay, he maintained a remarkably convincing heterosexual facade. But here's what's telling. The accusations intensified as Hugh's power grew. When he was a mere courtier, no one questioned his sexuality. But when he controlled the kingdom, suddenly everyone knew he was engaging in sexual activity with the king. The correlation between power and sexual accusation is too consistent to be coincidental. The propaganda campaign was sophisticated. Poems circulated depicting Hugh and Edward in explicitly sexual terms. Anonymous letters were sent to foreign courts, claiming that England was ruled by sodomy. Sermons were preached about unnatural vices in high places, without naming names. It was plausible deniability with maximum impact. Medieval conceptions of sodomy encompassed more than just homosexuality. It included any non-procreative sex, heresy, and political disorder. Accusing someone of sodomy wasn't merely about their sexuality, it was about cosmic disruption. Sodomites didn't just sin personally, they threatened the natural order. The strategic value of sexual rumors was immense. Medieval society believed that sodomy caused natural disasters, military defeats, and divine punishment. By associating Hugh with sodomy, his enemies held him responsible for every misfortune that befell England. A poor harvest? Hugh's sodomy angered God. A lost battle? Divine punishment for tolerating sodomites. The political weaponization cannot be overstated. In medieval law, sodomy was punishable by burning. But more importantly, it justified rebellion. If the king was engaging in sodomy, nobles had a moral obligation to intervene. The accusation turned treason into religious duty. Modern historians remain divided. Some believe that genuine romantic and sexual relationships existed between Edward and his male favorites. Others view these relationships as intense political partnerships that were sexualized by their enemies. The available evidence doesn't definitively prove either interpretation. What we can say with certainty is that Edward II formed unusually intense attachments to male favorites. These relationships excluded others from power, creating resentment and suspicion. Whether they included physical intimacy is unknowable, but the political intimacy was undeniable and threatening to established power structures. The gendered nature of medieval power